Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. As you'll know by now, the goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who rise up and beat the odds to create exceptional value within procurement in their own words and from them directly. My friend Kris Lance is definitely one of those heroes. Kris is the Vice President and General Manager at Una. And for the last few years, I've had a recurring monthly conversation with him on the Sourcing Hero podcast, where we discuss current news stories, trends, and supply chain issues. In today's very first episode of 2025, Happy New Year, by the way, I'm actually going to take a look back at 3 of Kris' most popular episodes from last year. He discusses the surging power of the podcast to drive business impact. He talks about how to fight off professional inertia and fatigue to find joy in your work. And then we both discuss the launch of Kris' new newsletter, a thought-provoking must-read for supply chain and procurement professionals. We'll listen to a short clip from each of these 3 episodes. And of course, you can find links to the full episodes as well as to Kris' newsletter in today's show notes. In the first of our 3 best of episodes, Kris and I got a little meta as we talked about why podcasts are such a powerful and popular content platform. Podcasts have been growing in popularity for years, but the 2024 presidential election in the United States really brought to light in very interesting ways just how much of an important role podcasts now play politically, in our culture, and in the business world. In this clip from that conversation, Kris explains why listening to someone on a podcast can carry so much more weight than other channels, and, most importantly, what you should and shouldn't do if you ever find yourself as a guest on a podcast.
My advice would probably be, and I recognize I'm saying this to myself, and what I probably would have rolled my eyes if someone said this, but it's as simple as like stop worrying about other people and their thoughts, right? Kind of like what we've just covered today.
Yeah.
Like people want the authenticity. I think some of my concerns was like, man, everyone's gonna listen to this and pick apart, I said something wrong, or I took something out of context, or I didn't quote something correctly. And it's like, if you really think about it, like nobody really cares about that. What they care about is just the actual information. So my advice is, if you're going to do it, but jump in with both feet.
Yeah.
and just stay true to yourself, and then be honest with yourself, right? Like stay in your lane. If you don't know, say, I don't know. There's nothing to earn more respect than that, right? So that's what I would say. But the authenticity, people are going to be able to tell. So if you're nervous, yeah, people might be able to tell, but that's okay.
That's right. It's real.
It is. And that's what they want. So that's what I think. And then I would also encourage people to just, again, really lean into like the realness. Don't try and put up a bravado or be something that you're not, because the vast majority of the people listening, they're not billionaires or even millionaires. And so don't try to come off as that. Don't worry about the imposter syndrome. Just say what you have to say, especially if it's an opinion based. And if it's a factual conversation, just make sure you have your receipts. And if your receipts are wrong, you can always point to them. So I guess I would just say is like, don't overthink it. Cause if there's anybody who overthinks, it's me. And I overthought it. And we probably should have been, instead of 2.5 years, Kelly, we probably should have been doing it for 3. But yeah, that would be my advice. Like it's not as serious as you're making it out to be in your mind.
I love how Kris really stresses authenticity here. We have been working on the Sourcing Hero podcast together for 2.5 years now. And for many of our guests, it's actually their first time on a podcast ever. One of the most important things I tell them is whatever you do, Don't read notes or overprepare. The best podcast conversations happen when the exchange is genuine, authentic, and natural. Switching gears a bit, in our second most popular episode of the year with Kris Lance, we take a bit of a turn to a topic that's, well, down, but no less important. Back in July, Kris joined me for a heavier conversation about how individuals, teams, and even whole organizations can fight off the feeling of inertia or fatigue or even boredom. That feeling you get when you've lost your momentum and sense of joy at work. And it seems to affect all of us at one time or another in our careers. Now, hopefully for most people, that low energy feeling is short-lived. But Kris made a good point in this episode that a feeling of apathy doesn't always just magically disappear. Sometimes we, or even company leadership, have to proactively develop methods and programs to pull ourselves and our colleagues out of the professional doldrums and find purpose and enjoyment in what we do. Here's how Kris put it.
I think people are giving into some of these thoughts. What I want to do is I really want to I want to caution people on it, right? When you're talking about mindset and things like that, it's kind of like excellence in like the reverse of it, where it's really, I would argue it's impossible to compartmentalize this. So I would actually caution people that anyone with that mindset of like, I'm sinking, it's no, you better figure that out quickly because I've seen it time and time again. It will impact other areas outside of, just work or your career. And so with that, and then we were talking about, you mentioned kind of like a reward system. I think once upon a time, we as leaders, I never did this, but I think as leaders, or the thought process was that you could kind of dangle, percentages in front of people, and, maybe the carrot would do the work from a motivational perspective. But, back to other things I'm hearing or seeing, to be clear, not necessarily at Una, just in my network.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing people look at bonuses right now and they're saying, that's it. Like I'm good. And that kind of knocked me back, because normally that was, funds are the way to kind of covers all sins. But
Yeah.
when I pressed into that a little bit further, what I ended up getting is, so we talked about, I think we did, I know I did a newsletter on Boeing, right? And so not in great shape right now, or I'll say all of 2023, not a great year for them. That CEO's salary was north of $32 million. And so if I'm somebody who's working on the engine of a plane, making X, and the CEO is making 32 million, I think, I'll say it this way, financially, I think incentives are just so screwed up. And I think there's a lot of people making good money, and some of them are actually kind of like the least productive. And those same unproductive people are actually the ones using the pivot tables to fire hundreds, if not thousands of people. And so, you got these CEOs going on LinkedIn and they're crying about layoffs. And I guess where I'm going with all this is I don't think anybody's really buying it anymore. And so for me, look, I haven't sold a business for 10X. I haven't written any bestsellers on leadership, but I did caution on this very thing, a few years ago. I think it was like 4 years ago, because the writing was on the wall, like the workforce and leadership, that there's been a growing divide and disconnection. And so you pour these poly crises on top of it, it's a recipe for disaster. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing. And so I guess for all the leaders listening, I'll land the plane here. Everyone is motivated differently. And I think as a leader, it's not your responsibility. You are obligated as a leader to connect those personal goals to company goals, because that's real motivation. And I think the companies that are able to do that, and the leaders that are doing that, they're still seeing those high performers perform.
Kris hit on something so important here, which is when a company or business leaders are able to connect what employees truly value and care about with what the company can provide and the company's own goals. When you have that kind of value and priority alignment between employee and company, then people are much more likely to be motivated, energized, and even happy to be active and engaged contributors to the business. And finally, in our third Best of Kris episode for 2024, Kris makes a pretty exciting announcement for Una and the procurement community. This last year, after more than 150 podcast episodes, the Sourcing Hero podcast finally got a much-welcomed sidekick. In addition to his regular appearances on the podcast, Kris launched Una's new procurement newsletter called The Sidekick, where he explores important issues facing procurement, as well as some breaking news and other fun stuff, all for a procurement and supply chain audience. At the time we recorded this episode, Kris had just published the first edition, and now he has more than 10 under his belt. If you're not already subscribed to the Sidekick newsletter, there's a link in today's show notes for you. Here's a short clip of what Kris and I discussed about how he's injecting a little procurement humor into the newsletter, while also driving at some deeper truths about what it means to be a good leader and a sourcing hero. Well, now we talked about some of the quotes that you share, and you quoted one of the people that I think is absolutely fascinating in the first edition. You quoted Isaac Asimov, and if people don't know him, he's a sci-fi writer that was known for creating or documenting, in his case, what he calls the 3 laws of robotics. And as you go through it, it's almost like etiquette, but a little bit more, so it's like, how are robots and human beings supposed to interact? And I think there's probably a little bit of wishful thinking in there. But the exact quote you shared is, people who think they know everything are a great annoyance to those of us who do, which is so funny. I would love to know why you picked this particular quote and sort of how it relates in your mind to either some of the things that we're doing in work or some of the other stories that were in the last edition of the newsletter.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you took it as funny, because as soon as it went live and I did my own review as if I was a reader, right? I said, oh my goodness, like everyone's going to think this is hilarious, or that I'm the most arrogant human being on the face of the earth. So what my goal was I thought it was like that intellectual humor, right? Like a super dry take on the concept of arrogance and overconfidence. But so most people, in my experience, most people live life as if they're their own main character in their own movie, which I get it. But when that confidence crosses over into leading them to dismiss the ideas or perspectives of others, not opening your mind to be wrong, that's when it becomes a problem. So to me, taking the leap of sharing information, right? It's that friendly reminder that you don't know what you don't know. So
Yeah.
Stay humble.
A great final reminder from Kris for all of us to stay humble and stay open to other people's ideas and perspectives, even if it means you might have to rethink your own. That is especially good advice as we begin a new year that promises a lot of uncertainty and change. So thank you to Kris for another year of thoughtfulness, insight, and authenticity. And we look forward to more of these conversations and editions of The Sidekick in 2025. Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.